This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Go to cardkingdom.com to find great prices on sealed product and singles. If you want to buy some of the cards on this list, that's a great place to do it. Hello everyone, I'm Nita Hone, and it is Friday, so that means it's time for another MTG Top 10. As has been the case on the first two MTG Top 10s in the month of October, this is a Top 10 that is Halloween inspired. In this week's video, I'm going to be talking about 10 creatures that have made the biggest impact on competitive Magic, specifically creatures that don't stay in the graveyard for very long. And I thought it would be a good one during a month where people watch movies and dress up as things that rise from the dead, like zombies and vampires. To be eligible for this list, a creature has to be able to return itself from the graveyard to the battlefield. In other words, cards that return themselves from your graveyard to your hand don't cut it for this list. They have to go from being buried 1 minute to walking around on the battlefield the next. Before we get started, a quick reminder on how I score these lists. Pro Tour, Vintage, and Legacy Championship top 8s are worth 2 points, and Grand Prix top 8s are worth 1 point. At number 10, we have the first of 3 zombies to make the list, and this one is Prized Amalgam. Prized Amalgam loves all the other cards on this list too, since a creature returning to the battlefield from the graveyard or being cast from the graveyard makes it so he comes back. So if you decided to make a deck around these effects, Prized Amalgam is a good place to start. In Standard, it saw play in Rakdos aggro, alongside Scrap Heap, Scrounger, and Haunted Dead, both of whom can return from the graveyard, so it was never there for very long. It has seen more play in Modern, though, where the return of Dredge decks in 2016, after Golgari Grave Troll was briefly unbanned, coupled with the printing of Cathartic Reunion, made it into a really good deck for a while. Even after the rebanning of the Troll, it is still seeing some play in Dredge in Modern, but that deck isn't nearly as good as it once was. At number 9, we have another creature type that makes more than one appearance on this list, and that is Phoenixes, and the one at number 9 is Flamewake Phoenix. The Phoenix has some nice stats, but it gets the most value out of being able to return from the graveyard to the battlefield for a single red mana if you have a creature that is big enough to trigger Ferocious. An evasive threat that swings as soon as it comes into play can quickly pressure your opponents. It saw a bit of play in standard red aggro decks, but it has recently found a much more prominent home in modern Hollow One decks, which aim to discard a ton of cards early and play Hollow One for free, or at least at a discount. Flamewake Phoenix fits perfectly into this strategy because you don't really care if it gets discarded. As soon as you have a Hollow One in play, the Phoenix will be coming back from the graveyard and doing a ton of damage alongside its golem friend. It figures to continue to see play there going forward, probably surpassing several creatures on this list in front of it. At number 8, we have a creature who you can bring back from your graveyard, but only if you have 1 or fewer cards in your hand, and that is Dread Wanderer. It boasts nice aggressive stats already, and the fact that you can bring it back in the late game is pretty nice, as it lets you dump your mana into something that affects the board instead of doing nothing. It was an excellent fit for mono-black zombie decks while it was legal in Standard. It had the useful creature type and aggressive stats the deck wanted, in addition to being resilient. However, it stopped seeing play in Standard after the bulk of the deck rotated, and now the Dread Wanderer itself is rotated out of Standard, and it doesn't seem like a great candidate to see play in non-rotating formats in the future. At number 7, we have a creature who can come back from the graveyard if you cast enough creature spells, and that's Vengevine. Like several cards on this list, it comes with haste, which allows it to attack as soon as it climbs out of the graveyard. It saw play in Standard, with its most impressive finish being 5 top 8s at Grand Prix Sendai in 2010, where it showed up in Bant aggro decks that played plenty of cheap creatures like Birds of Paradise and Noble Hierarch, which also happen to produce mana, making it so you can cast even more creature spells. So bringing it back from the graveyard wasn't too difficult. It picked up a lone Grand Prix top 8 in an extended deck fittingly called Vengevine Naya. It's also seen some play in Legacy, because decks in that format have no problem loading the graveyard, and it found its way into Blue-Green Madness decks between 2010 and 2011, which could discard it early and bring it back for free later. It has also managed to put up 2 Vintage Championship top 8s earlier in 2018, both in reanimation decks. Recently, it's found some success in Modern too, with a black-red Vengevine deck getting a top 8 at Pro Tour 25th. This deck could load up its graveyard and played several other creatures on this list that also come out of the graveyard. With a pretty successful 2018 that has already added 6 points to the score, I wouldn't be too surprised to see Vengevine continue to move up. At number 6, we have the oldest card on the list, and that's Ikran. One really cool thing about Ikran, before we get to talking about the actual card, is that it was printed in Torment when they decided to put a cool tombstone icon next to the names of any creatures or spells that could do something from the graveyard. They didn't do this for very long. Obviously, if they did, every card on this list would have it, and that would definitely be a little more Halloween-y. Honestly, I kind of wish they still did it. It adds a nice touch to these kinds of cards. So we already talked about Prized Amalgam, which was a big part of dredge decks recently, but Ikran was the win condition for the very first dredge decks. The idea being, mill a massive portion of your deck with dredge and other effects, then return several Ikrans every turn until your opponent is dead. It barely saw any play in block and didn't see any play in standard, but neither of those formats had access to dredge. Where it really shined was in extended, where you did have access to dredge and it was super easy to fill your graveyard. Its most dominant showing was at Grand Prix Vienna, where 4 of the top 8 and 8 of the top 16 decks were dredge decks featuring Ikran. While Extended ended, Ikran has also managed to find its way into dredge decks in Legacy and Vintage too. It has a top 8 at the European Vintage Championships in a dredge deck just earlier this year, and I think it will continue to slowly creep up this list. At number 5, we have a zombie that can come back from the graveyard to the battlefield, but only if one of his friends is hanging out there, and that is Gravecrawler. Sporting aggressive stats and resilience, he is one of the best things for a deck with several zombies in it to play on turn 1. As one would expect, Gravecrawler saw play in standard in decks that had a lot of zombies in them. Some of them were more dedicated zombie decks, while others were Rakdos aggro decks that ran enough zombies for Gravecrawler to still be worth it. Gravecrawler's ability to come back from the graveyard also managed to nab it a top 10 in Legacy as well in 2012 in a deck built around Goblin Bombardment, where its ability to come back from the graveyard meant doing a ton of damage. It also found its way into the same modern deck that Vengevine was in at Pro Tour Magic 25th. It combos especially nicely with Vengevine because if you mill it into your graveyard when you mill your Vengevine, it can count toward the 2 creatures you cast that turn to bring Vengevine out of the graveyard. This could be a sign that it will find its way into more modern top 8s going forward. At number 4, we have the only vampire to make the list, and that's Bloodgased. Bloodgast's requirement for coming back is pretty easy. You just have to play a land, something you play all the time in Magic. It also has haste sometimes, so if you have a few of these in your graveyard and your opponent is at 10 or less life, it can be a real nightmare for them. While in Standard, it only managed a single top 8, at Worlds in 2010 in a vampire deck. In Extended, it found its way into a deck several cards on this list have found success in, and that's of course Dredge, though it only had 2 Pro Tour top 8s in that format. It has done the most damage in Modern, where it has been played in dredge decks when they were viable, and more recently it has seen play alongside Flamewake Phoenix and Hollow One decks that, again, discard a ton of cards, and that downside can be erased by a card like Bloodgased. In Legacy, it has a lone Grand Prix top 8 alongside Gravecrawler in the Goblin Bombardment deck we just talked about. It figures to continue to see play in Modern going forward. At number 3, we have a creature with one of the most maligned mechanics around, and that's Death Mist Raptor, who has the lazily named Megamorph. Basically a lazy spin on Morph, Megamorph is not the most inspired design by Wizards. However, the rest of what this card does is pretty cool, with Death Mist Raptor capable of trading for anything thanks to Death Touch and having good stats. The fact it can come back from the graveyard when you turn another Morph creature face up is pretty scary. What's more is you can do it at instant speed, something the other cards on this list aren't capable of doing. They can't come back from the graveyard at instant speed. It was in Standard alongside fellow Megamorpher Den Protector, and the two of them provided some pretty insane value for green decks. Imagine turning the Den Protector face up, getting back a removal spell from your graveyard, and also bringing a Death Mist Raptor back into play. This was a pretty common occurrence in the Standard of the time. As cool as Death Mist Raptor was in Standard, no one plays Morph creatures in non-rotating formats these days, and as a result, it hasn't found a home since rotating. It does have potential should Morph ever return, which I think is pretty likely, but there would have to be some pretty powerful creatures to make it worth it in non-rotating formats. For now, it has several cards right behind it that are still seeing play in non-rotating formats, so its position on the list is in trouble. At number 2, we have the only card on the list that is still in Standard, and that's Rekindling Phoenix. This Phoenix has a pretty weird trigger compared to most of the cards on this list. It can only be brought back by an elemental token it leaves behind when it dies. If that token is destroyed, the Phoenix is stuck in your graveyard. But it definitely makes up for that with aggressive, evasive stats and the fact that when it comes back from your graveyard it gains haste, so it doesn't really miss a beat if you have to trade it for something. It has already been pretty dominant in Standard in its time, and if you are running a red, there's no good reason not to run these. Its primary home in the format has been aggro decks, with black-red aggro being its most common home. It figures to continue to see play as long as it's in Standard, but even with that going on, it seems unlikely that it'll ever pass the number 1 card on this list, which is the only artifact on this list and a creature that only just recently rotated out of Standard, and that's Scrap Heap Scrounger. Like a lot of the cards on this list, it couples the resilience of coming back from the graveyard with very aggressive stats, and this is the kind of thing that always sees play, especially when it's an artifact. While it has only seen play in Standard so far, it was one of the most ubiquitous cards around since you could easily play it off a small black splash. Early on, during its time in Standard, it found its way into decks that could take advantage of the artifact type, like the various vehicle decks, But it also saw play in a multitude of aggro decks that were running at least a little black. For example, the various Winding Constrictor decks, red-black aggro, Mardu aggro, Jund Energy decks, mono-black zombies, and you get the picture. Basically, any creature-based deck with black in it was running this when it was in Standard, allowing it to amass a score of 117, one that probably won't be approached by any cards on this list anytime soon. Well, that does it for this week's MTG Top 10. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future MTG Top 10s, including the final Halloween-inspired Top 10 of the year next week, don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching.